Please be respectful to these opinions. These are mine and mine alone. Feel free to disagree or agree. Well, let's get started. Number 11. Percy gets it right. This is going to be one of those episodes that confuses people as to why it's on this list, but to me, Percy Gets It Right has a special place in my heart. Percy Gets It Right is one of the first episodes that I remember watching. I know that it wasn't the first, but when I think back to when I was a kid, it's one of the first things that I can remember. I remember waking up on Christmas morning and opening up that present, seeing the VHS, and I was just so happy. But nostalgia isn't the only reason I like this episode. I really love Percy's character. He's persistent, investigative, and he just doesn't feel listened to. The line after he speaks to Gordon,
"Gordon never listens to me," muttered Percy.
It sounds so pathetic, but it's funny at the same time. It might just be Angelique's delivery of the line, but for some reason I just love it. Moving on, I just love Thomas's crash in this episode. I always thought that the mudslide kind of looked like chocolate, and that Thomas was really just eating a lot of chocolate. But that was my first impression. I can also remember taking my Tommy Thomas outside into the yard and recreating this crash, but eventually he stopped working. Might have been my fault. It's okay, I had like 5 other ones anyway. Side note, was anybody else worried by the Fat Controller's least bit of concern about the bumpy tracks? You'd think he'd care for his railway, but I guess not. Number 10. Toby and the Stout Gentleman. Toby, oh Toby, what would we do without you? Toby is far too underutilized by the writers these days. He doesn't feel like he's even a part of the STEAM team. Toby and the Stout Gentleman really is where my affinity for Toby stems from, both now and when I was a kid. I remember Toby the Tram Engine was one of the only Railway Series books that I owned when I was little. That and Henry the Green Engine. However, out of Toby's introduction, this story was by far my favourite. For one, these sets were incredible. They are some of my favourite all-time sets the show has ever produced, both live action and CGI. The sprawling mountains, the green hills and the blue lakes, it feels so real, and it's just kind of somewhere that I would want to visit if it were real. Moving on, the story is just kind of sad. While it may not seem so on a surface level as it begins, as the story progresses, it just gets sadder and sadder as you realise what effect modernization is having on the lives of Toby and his crew. This episode actually deals with quite mature themes. The more I think about it, the more I come to the realization that we're just kind of selfish. We do what we do to benefit ourselves, but we don't think of the effect that it will have on the things and people around us. Just like how the manager was sending goods and passengers by road, one of the final lines disregarding really Toby and Henriette to me.
"Nobody wants me," Toby thought, and went unhappily to sleep.
I'm sure this is a feeling that lots of people have had, and while I personally have not ever felt this way, I can totally understand it, especially when Toby is in the situation that he's in. And then the episode ends on a feel-good moment, because we all know everything is going to be okay. Number 9. Toby's Tightrope. Oh look, another episode that I don't hear people talking about much nowadays. I don't know much about the fanbase's stance on this episode, but for me personally, one of the reasons I love Toby's Tightrope so much is because it has actual character development. Although this episode, coupled with Mavis, could be considered a two-parter, I prefer the former over the latter. And why is this episode's character development any different to episodes such as Paint Pots and Queens? Well, that would be because the character development that Mavis receives here is permanent. She starts off as a bit of a brat, but as the episode progresses, she gets better by the end and she becomes a respectful character within the series. She starts off as a character who needs advice, and then she transforms into a character who gives advice. I love that kind of stuff. I also love Toby's character in this episode. He's kind and forgiving, but he also is a good mentor. Lastly, how can I talk about this episode and not mention the crash? While there are no explosions and no one gets hurt, a la season 5, I think it's a very cool concept and I love how it plays out. The bridge falling beneath Toby's wheels and all that's left of the rails, it just makes her a really cool shot. Having this be Mavis's saving grace as well is just something I really enjoy. I'm not sure why, but I just kind of love when the engines, or just characters in general, have to solve a situation that they created. Even though she set it up and probably expects some form of punishment, in the end she ends up winning, or they both do. She gets to ride on Toby's line, and she's a hero. In terms of development, Mavis has had some of the best and most permanent character changes, and that's why this episode is on the list. Number 8. Thomas and Stepney. Oh, Stepney, one of my favourite engines of the entire series. I can't explain why I like Stepney so much. He feels like such a charismatic and kind character. I think another part as to why I like Stepney so much is because he's real. Although we have had real engines in the past such as City of Truro, Stepney is the first one to actually have a proper character. I mean, City of Truro didn't even have a face. I think this episode is the first time we were introduced to the trope where Thomas is sick of the new engine. By now, it's been done to death that we're all sick of it, but in this early episode, I think it was done quite well. We've seen something new of Thomas's character. Not one where he's arrogant or super kind, but one where he's just jealous. And I think that's something that everyone can relate to. Of course, it eventually gets old after the third or fourth time, but when it started, it was something that was actually quite refreshing. I've also got to give a mention to the set designers. Season 4 has some of the best sets, and this episode further emphasizes this. The opening shot with Thomas going through Callendale is absolutely beautiful, and I don't know why that set was never used again. I also think the design of Tidmouth Sheds in Season 4 was the best it's ever been. It may have been the same set from Season 3, Season 2 and 1, but it just looks the best with the way that they dress it up. It looks busy, it looks like a place where real engines would actually be. The shot with Stepney passing through Knapford Station with all the engines around him is probably one of my favourite moments. It just looks so good. And finally, Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell really did a great job with Stepney's theme. It's so jovial and upbeat that it just fits his character. All in all, this episode ticks all the boxes. We get a proper introduction to Stepney's character, and we get to see a new side of Thomas. I love it. Number 7. Snow. And now we've reached Season 5, my favourite season of them all. Let's see how this goes. Snow is an episode worthy of praise because of the way it handles comedy and its serious tone. As the episode opens, we get the establishing shots of winter, as we normally do. But then the scene shifts to Percy, stuck in the snow. This scene has perfect setup for the rest of the episode that is to follow, both in its comedy and tone. Plus, I always liked Thomas's lack of care for Percy in this episode. It's just funny.
Ha! Huff Thomas.
This perfectly encapsulates both Thomas's character and the tone for the episode. He hates snow, so he's obviously not in a good mood, so he's obviously not going to care. And then it just plays on the comedy. Moving on to Rusty's story is where the meat of the episode really takes place, and I love it. I love having to see how the mountainous engines would have to deal with the terrain in winter. I always thought that the winch was an actual character, so whenever I would make stories with my narrow gauge engine toys, I'd usually make the winch a character. Most of the time it would just deal with the trucks, but I liked giving it some kind of backstory. I don't remember anything I made up now, but it's still fun to think about. And of course, because we're entering Season 5 territory, we've got crashes. The crash in snow is so over the top that it quickly became one of my all-time favorites. I mean, I swear these trucks are suicidal. Like, who would do something like this in a normal mind state? And then in the end, it's revealed that no one was hurt, nothing happened, and it turns out that no one gave a damn. That's what makes it funny. This episode, no one seems to care about anything. Thomas doesn't care about Percy, Skarloey doesn't care about himself, the trucks don't care about themselves, and Skarloey's driver and fireman don't seem to care that they almost died, and they're just having cocoa and laughing. That's the comedy. Just no one cares. And then Gordon just appears out of nowhere with his machine and just ruins everyone's day. That's the best way they could have ended this episode, in my opinion. It's just funny. I can't watch this without laughing. Number 6. Rusty and the Boulder. Rusty and the Boulder is one of those debatable episodes, and I can absolutely see why. In a time where realism was still prevalent within the TV series, this episode stuck out as something completely unrealistic and just weird. But what I think makes this episode stand out is both its tone and its sense of scale. When looking at Rusty next to the boulder, you can see how much of a prevalent force the boulder is. It's huge compared to Rusty, and it's something that actually poses a threat. Furthermore, the sets look absolutely ginormous. The main yard and the hills all look like they go on forever, and I think that's a part of it that makes this episode feel so big. Everything just looks bigger than it actually is. Moving on to tone, Rusty and the Boulder has an immense sense of mystery and eeriness. The shots of Boulder's face appearing and disappearing give a sense of mystery, as we don't know who or what the boulder is. But its facial expressions convey sadness, showing how, possibly due to the new activity around it, it's sad that its home is getting destroyed. The scene which uses this tone to its best advantage is the ending, most notably the scene with the Fat Controller and Boulder. Angeli's delivery of these lines sends shivers down my spine. It's just so eerie, and coupled with the music, it's sad. And yes, the crash at the end is beautiful. I like explosions. Who doesn't like explosions? At least not when they're hurting people. Unlike the rest of Season 5, Rusty and the Boulder has a similar kind of tone to episodes such as Haunted Henry, but it's not scary. It's mysterious, eerie, and sad, and that's what makes it stand out. Number 5. Special Funnel. This was a tough one because I had no idea where I wanted to put this on the list. I was thinking of putting Rusty and the Boulder as my number 5 and Special Funnel as my number 6, but I opted against that obviously, and here we are. But thinking on it now, Rusty and the Boulder and Special Funnel are interchangeable. To quote The Unlucky Tug, Special Funnel has quite a simple premise. Peter Sam loses his funnel and has to get a new one. There's a lack of dialogue, and most of the speech is done through the narrator. But what makes this episode so great is its visuals and the world it manages to create. Coming from England myself, I can totally relate to the scenery. Misty and cold and damp. It's just like a normal winter's day. Watching the mist roll over the hills is both serene and depressing at the same time, and I've got to attribute that to the music that plays. It just feels so solemn, and I guess that's what the whole sequence is trying to portray. It's a pathetic fallacy. The weather is representing the mood. Special Funnel did give me one of my all-time favorite sequences in the show, Rusty mending the bridge.
As days went by, the weather changed. It became frosty and much colder.
The visuals shift from grey clouds to blue sky and a calm river. I guess it's supposed to just feel calming, and I think it achieves that really well. And who am I kidding, the narrow gauge sets look amazing in winter. Wish we saw more of it. Number 4. Tobys Discovery. Finally, the spooky episodes. When I was younger, I grew up in Singapore, and in Singapore we didn't have the conventional DVDs and VHS tapes that everyone else had in the UK and the US. Instead, I had this, Haunted Henry and Other Thomas Adventures. This DVD contained spooky episodes from Season 5, including Haunted Henry, obviously, and Tobys Discovery. This episode just feels so unsettling. It starts off happy, you don't expect it to take such a weird turn, but as Toby goes on his adventure discovering the castle and the mine, the tone shifts and you just kind of feel odd. I don't know how it manages to do that. It might have to do with all the scrap engines laid around in the mine or just the abandoned aesthetic, but it's just not nice. And then night came. This is where the episode really picks up, and this is where it really gets me. The fog effects really add something special to the episode and really emphasizes the creepiness of it all. In the music, you can hear subtle hints of Ring Around a Rosie, and it just makes this episode way scarier than it already was. I always thought that pole was just a person watching me. I hate Toby's scared face, and the driver just... ugh. We also got to meet Bertram, and I wish he was used more, as I feel like he's got an interesting backstory, but maybe that's a story for another day. In the end, the episode lightens up, and everything's back as it was. This episode... wow, this episode... nothing else to say, and that's why it's number 4. Number 3. Haunted Henry. Here we are, my all-time favourite spooky episode. The visuals, the music, the narration, it's just so perfect in establishing a spooky atmosphere, and it's just wonderful. And I won't lie, whenever I hear that owl sound effect on any other show, I always think back to Haunted Henry. The moment when Henry goes through the forest for the first time always gives me chills. It's the sense of the unknown. We have no idea what's happening, no idea of who put those things there, and no idea why they're there.
Henry crept slowly forward.
The way Angeles delivers that line is just so perfect. It's menacing, it's deep, it's dark. Who knows what's about to happen?
And there's a fogman's coat.
Another great piece of narration. The wind effects in the background, which I only actually notice now, is just spooky. Altogether, it's just... ugh. I think the scene with the house and the lights is my all-time scariest moment of the entire series. As a kid, I had no idea what was happening, and when the light finally turned off, it just chilled me to the bone. While the episode's story isn't that complex, I still think it does a wonderful job of conveying scaredness and horror. It's wonderful all around. After my long break from the show, I came back and watched this episode, and the moment with Gordon thundering by Henry scared me. I actually jumped, and I wasn't expecting to jump. That's what makes Haunted Henry so good. It's just got surprises round every corner. And then we reach the final act, Henry pushing his trucks through the forest. I just love this scene. When the gates close and the light comes on, that was spooky. And then the music, it just feels so dangerous and nervous. I don't know how it conveys nervousness, but I just feel nervous for the characters. And then the trucks hit the landslide and barrel down the hill into the valley. This crash just feels epic, like something, it's on its own scale. And in the end, we learn it was all a simple misunderstanding. I wish we could see this station again, and I'd love to see old Bailey and Henry interact in the CGI series. Maybe even have a flashback. Now that would be epic. Number 2. Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty. As others have so eloquently put it, Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty make up one story, hence why they're together on this list. I can't separate them when they're a two-parter. These stories serve as a wonderful introduction to the narrow gauge engines, despite only being 3, but still. Since it was the first episodes of Season 4, Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty were the first episodes to have those amazing narrow gauge sets. The roaming hills, the deep valleys, it looked so realistic, but also still had that model aesthetic, and it was just so beautiful. These episodes also emphasized the relationship between the 3 characters. They've been friends for many years, and they had the lines all to themselves, but as Stuart and Falcon get sent away, they keep a happy facade on for Duke, knowing that perhaps they will meet again, even though they highly doubt it, and it's just sad, knowing that they're going to be taken away from each other. Watching Duke say goodbye to his driver and fireman, put in the shed and his eventual sleep, is just so depressing, and watching as the shed gets overgrown by leaves and mud, knowing that Duke's inside all alone, it's heartbreaking, really. However, in the end, the 3 are reunited in a lovely scene. They're pretending that nothing happened, and they're going back to the way that things once were. It really is nice to see characters reunite after such a long time. These episodes just hit all the feels. Well, not as much as number 1. Time for some special mentions. These episodes were hard to place because I couldn't explain why I liked them so much. I just kinda do. You can slot these anywhere besides the top 3. Here we go. Number 1. Henry's Forest. Wow, what a surprise. If you've followed my channel long enough, or have followed me on Twitter, you probably know what I think of this episode, as you probably already should, seeing as it's number 1. Henry's Forest just feels so right. It just feels so perfect. It conveys emotion that I think is unparalleled to any episode in the series, and that's surprising considering this is a kids' show. This is the episode that made me fall in love with Henry as a character. I think this might be due to the human characteristics that he has. He has sadness that we all have. He has happiness that we all have. He feels so relatable, having lost something. This episode isn't afraid to be sad. In fact, I think it embraces its own sadness. Unlike other episodes that have sadness, this episode puts it at the forefront. It's not an undertone, it's not in the background. It's something that's built upon and the whole story revolves around. And as we follow Henry down this path, we realize how emotionally invested we are in the episode, or at least I was. And by the end, when Toby manages to bring back the trees and they help rebuild the forest just like old times, that always gets me. It's a wonderful sense of closure. We've come back to where we started, but we feel rewarded for the journey that we've gone through and all the pain that we've had to endure. I know that sounds cheesy and lame, but that's why I love Henry's Forest so much. And this last scene is just the icing on the cake.
Now Henry can see the trees growing strong and tall, and the animals are coming back. Sometimes everywhere is quiet, At other times, Henry can hear leaves rustling or a bird's wing brushing the air. Often he can hear the sound of children laughing, and always he is happy here.